Dr. Evelyn Holt sat quietly in the dim light of her living room, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion after yet another grueling 14-hour shift. Outside, the city lay cloaked in darkness, the streets silent except for the occasional hum of passing cars. Her apartment was sparsely decorated, a small testament to her priorities. Life for Evelyn revolved around the operating room. A cup of half-finished tea sat cold on the coffee table, untouched since she'd arrived home 2 hours ago. She had barely managed to kick off her shoes and collapse onto the worn leather couch, intending to rest for just a moment. Yet, in the silence, her thoughts refused to still. Memories of the day's operations played in her mind like an endless reel, hands steady, scalpels sharp, blood carefully directed through machines as she brought patients back from the brink of death. Lives that had been moments away from slipping into darkness now continued because of her. But even the satisfaction of saving lives did not bring her peace tonight. Her body ached in ways that only surgeons understood, and her mind drifted in the uncomfortable space between wakefulness and sleep. Evelyn's phone buzzed violently against the glass surface of the table, pulling her back into reality. At first, she ignored it, instinctively assuming it was yet another administrative email or non-emergency notification. It wasn't until the persistent vibration grew louder, almost like a heartbeat, that she reluctantly reached for it. Her tired eyes squinted at the screen, immediately narrowing as she read the message, "Code critical, cardiac transplant. Arrive at the airfield. Patient 8F. Heart en route. 30-min window." The message was from the hospital's head nurse, who only ever sent texts like this when the situation was desperate. Evelyn's chest tightened as adrenaline surged through her veins, washing away her fatigue in an instant. 30 minutes. That's all she had. She cursed under her breath, springing off the couch, her feet landing hard against the cold wooden floor. The room felt too small, the air suddenly sharp and unwelcoming. This wasn't just any transplant. A heart arriving via emergency transport meant that someone, likely a child, was teetering between life and death. Her hands moved quickly, methodically, as she pulled on the navy blue scrubs she always kept neatly folded in her hallway cabinet. Evelyn paused briefly to steady herself as she tied her hair into a tight bun, her hands trembling slightly from the sudden rush of urgency. There was no time for questions or second-guessing. This was a life. No, this was her patient's life. And Evelyn Holt, with all her experience and expertise, knew one universal truth: seconds mattered. Grabbing the sterile container she'd prepared earlier in the week in case of sudden emergencies like this, she zipped it carefully into a black carrying bag. It was a protocol drilled into her after years of cardiac surgeries, but tonight the weight of the container felt heavier than usual, as if it already knew how much depended on it. Evelyn glanced quickly at her phone again, calculating how long it would take to reach the airfield on the outskirts of the city. 20 minutes if she drove fast. 10 if she ignored the speed limits entirely. There was no room for mistakes. Her mind raced as she grabbed her car keys, her movements swift and mechanical. The moment Evelyn stepped outside, the night hit her like a slap. The air was icy and sharp, the kind of cold that could steal a person's breath if they weren't prepared for it. Her apartment complex's parking lot sat empty except for her sleek, silver sedan parked under a flickering streetlight. The engine roared to life as she slid into the driver's seat and adjusted the rearview mirror. Her reflection looked back at her sharp, focused, but unmistakably tired. There was no time to dwell on it. Evelyn pressed her foot to the accelerator and sped into the quiet streets, her headlights slicing through the thick darkness. As she drove, the city seemed unnaturally still. The traffic lights glowed ominously against the empty roads, their red and green hues blending into streaks of color as she barreled past them. The sterile container sat securely on the passenger seat, buckled in as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. Evelyn's knuckles turned white against the steering wheel as she pushed the car faster, her mind racing through the steps of the operation she would need to perform. She'd done it before. Transplants were always chaotic, but this situation felt different. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the thought of the patient being a child, someone who had barely tasted life before it was threatened to be taken away. Or maybe it was something deeper, an instinct she couldn't yet name. At the same time, Officer Riley Brooks sat slouched in his squad car a few miles away, parked in the shadows of an abandoned gas station. The car's interior glowed faintly from the dashboard light, casting harsh lines across his aging face. The night had been uneventful, which only made his mood worse. Brooks wasn't supposed to be here. 10 years ago, he'd imagined himself as a rising star in the department, a hard-edged officer taking down criminals and making a name for himself. But now, after years of mistakes, missed promotions, and a divorce that had left him bitter and angry, he found himself patrolling quiet neighborhoods at 3 a.m., drowning in resentment. He grumbled to himself as he sipped lukewarm coffee from a dented thermos, his eyes scanning the empty street ahead. It was always the same, nothing but shadows and silence. His radio crackled with a mundane report from dispatch, and he shut it off with a sharp flick of his wrist. Brooks didn't need to hear any more pointless chatter tonight. And then he saw it, a streak of silver cutting through the darkness. A car moving far too fast for this hour of the night. His instincts kicked in, old habits resurfacing like a long-buried reflex. "What do we have here?" he muttered, straightening up as he grabbed the wheel. The headlights of the speeding sedan reflected off his windshield, and his pulse quickened. Speeding cars in the middle of the night were never a good sign. Drugs, stolen goods, maybe worse. His mind leapt to conclusions as he switched on his lights and sirens, his adrenaline building. For a brief moment he almost felt alive again. Evelyn's heart dropped as the red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, the wail of the siren breaking the silence of the night. No, not now. Her foot eased off the gas instinctively as the car's speed dropped, but panic flared in her chest. She glanced at the container beside her, then at the ticking clock on her dashboard. 11 minutes left. She knew what this stop could mean: a delay, a life lost. Evelyn pulled the car to the side of the road, her breaths coming fast and shallow as the patrol car rolled up behind her. She fumbled for her ID, mentally rehearsing the words she would use to explain, but a sick feeling churned in her stomach. She'd dealt with men like this before, officers with skeptical eyes and condescending tones, who questioned her mere presence before listening to a word she said. Evelyn gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles aching as she waited. Officer Brooks stepped out of the squad car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the driver's side. His face was set in a hard line, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his holstered gun. Evelyn watched him in the mirror, every step making her pulse pound harder. The air felt heavier, the seconds longer. Finally, he stopped just short of her window, rapping on the glass with 2 sharp taps. "License and registration," he said, his voice low and authoritative. Evelyn's throat felt dry as she lowered the window and looked up at him. "Officer, I'm Dr. Evelyn Holt. I'm a cardiac surgeon, and I'm en route to an emergency." "License and registration," Brooks interrupted, his tone sharper this time. His eyes darted to the black carrying bag on the passenger seat, suspicion flashing across his face. "What's in the bag?" Evelyn swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain calm. "It's a sterile medical container. A human heart. I need to get it to the airfield in 10 minutes, or a child will die. But Brooks wasn't listening. His face hardened as his hand tightened on his belt. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Evelyn stared at him, her mind screaming. This can't be happening. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears as the officer's words hung in the frigid night air. "Step out of the car." For a fleeting moment, she considered refusing. She could already see the trajectory of this interaction spiraling toward disaster, a delay she couldn't afford, a misunderstanding she didn't have time to resolve. But she also knew better than to escalate the situation. Men like this didn't listen, and any sign of defiance would only embolden him. Her hands trembled slightly as she shut off the engine, grabbed the black medical bag, and slowly opened the car door. The cold hit her immediately, but it wasn't the wind that made her shiver. It was the overwhelming weight of what was happening. She stepped out, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The sterile bag clutched tightly against her chest like a lifeline. Officer Riley Brooks loomed over her, his flashlight beaming into her face, as though he intended to blind her into submission. Evelyn squinted but stood her ground, her face tight with controlled restraint. "I told you," she said carefully, her voice cutting through the silence, "I'm a cardiac surgeon. That bag contains a human heart for transplant. I am en route to an airfield where a critically ill child is waiting for me, if I don't get there." "Save the story," Brooks snapped, his lip curling in disdain, his flashlight lowered to the black bag in her arms. "I asked what's in the bag, and you're going to let me see for myself. Place it on the hood of the car." "No," Evelyn said instantly, her tone sharp enough to startle even herself. She hugged the bag closer, her fingers white-knuckling the straps. "This container is sterile. If you open it, even for a second, you'll contaminate the organ, and the child will die. Do you understand me? You cannot touch it." Brooks narrowed his eyes, taking a step closer to her. "Ma'am, you don't get to tell me what I can and can't do. It's my job to determine if you're transporting something illegal. And believe me, people come up with all kinds of clever excuses." He gestured toward the bag with the barrel of his flashlight. "Now put it on the hood, or I'll do it myself. Listen to me." Evelyn's voice broke, the sheer desperation cracking through her carefully constructed professionalism. "You don't know what you're doing. That heart is a child's only chance at survival. Enough." Brooks barked, his patience unraveling. He reached forward, his thick fingers grabbing for the bag. Evelyn twisted away instinctively, the container held protectively against her. "Don't touch it," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "You have no idea what's at stake." That was all it took. The subtle restraint Brooks had maintained up until this moment shattered. His face contorted with frustration, his authority undermined by what he perceived as defiance. He grabbed Evelyn's arm roughly, yanking her toward him with a force that nearly caused her to lose her footing. The sterile bag bumped against her side, and she gasped, heart lurching in terror. "Do not resist," Brooks growled. "You're acting suspicious, and I don't have time for your nonsense." Evelyn stared at him, her chest heaving. "I'm not resisting," she shot back, her voice trembling from equal parts fear and fury. "You are preventing me from saving a child's life." Brooks ignored her, his grip tightening as he forced her around, pulling her hands behind her back. Evelyn winced as cold steel cuffs snapped against her wrists, biting into her skin. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she struggled to process the absurdity of what was happening. A man who knew nothing about her, nothing about medicine or the gravity of this night, was cuffing her on the side of a deserted road, while the minutes bled away like sand through her fingers. "This is a mistake," she ground out through clenched teeth, her voice trembling with restrained rage. "You're making a catastrophic mistake. and you're going to regret it." Brooks said nothing as he forced her toward his squad car, the glare of the flashing red and blue lights turning her shadow long against the pavement. The container, the one thing that mattered, sat perched precariously on the hood of her car, its safety no longer guaranteed. Evelyn twisted her head over her shoulder, panic clawing up her throat. "That bag cannot stay out here. It's temperature controlled. It'll fail if—" "Get in the car," Brooks barked, cutting her off as he opened the back door and shoved her unceremoniously inside. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her ears. For a moment, Evelyn sat frozen in the suffocating dark of the squad car, her wrists aching from the cuffs and her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She craned her neck to see through the rear windshield, horror pooling in her stomach as Brooks picked up the container and held it aloft, squinting at it like a caveman encountering fire for the first time. "No," she whispered, a choked sob rising in her throat. "Don't do this! Please, God, don't do this!" From outside, Brooks turned the container over in his hands, studying its lock mechanism as if it were a puzzle to be solved. His fingers hovered near the seals and Evelyn felt her body go cold. If he opened that container, it would be over. There was no recovering from contamination. The heart would be useless, and the child waiting at the airfield would die. Evelyn banged her fists against the window, the sound muffled but frantic. "Don't open it," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Please, I'm begging you." Brooks glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression smug and unconcerned. "You've got a lot to say for someone who's already in cuffs. Maybe if you cooperated earlier, we wouldn't be here." Evelyn slumped back against the seat, tears blurring her vision as the full weight of her powerlessness crushed her. Every second that passed felt like a nail in the coffin of the child, whose life depended on her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind screaming in helpless rage. How had this happened? How had a night that began with purpose and urgency turned into this nightmare? In the distance, faint at first but growing louder, the roar of an approaching helicopter broke through the cold night air. Evelyn's eyes snapped open as the sound triggered a visceral reaction. The helicopter. It was coming for her. For the heart. For the patient whose life was slipping further out of reach with every wasted moment. Her gaze darted back to Brooks, who had also heard it. He stiffened, his expression shifting subtly as confusion and doubt flickered across his face. The radio on his belt crackled to life. A dispatch officer's voice cut through the tension, urgent and clipped. "Unit 12 report. Air medical team is inbound to the district airfield. Patient critical. Surgeon ETA unknown. Repeat, surgeon ETA unknown." Brooks froze, the container still in his hands. He turned his head slowly toward Evelyn, his face suddenly pale under the harsh glare of the flashing lights. Evelyn leaned forward as far as the cuffs would allow, her eyes locked on his. "That's my patient," she said hoarsely, her voice raw with desperation. "That's why I'm here. That's why I was speeding. You're killing that child." For the first time since he pulled her over, Brooks hesitated. The self-righteous certainty that had fueled his actions began to crack as realization took hold. He looked back at the container in his hands, his knuckles going white against its surface. The distant thrum of the helicopter grew louder, closer, like a ticking clock counting down the seconds he had wasted. Evelyn didn't look away. Her eyes burned into his, filled with fury, grief, and a plea that transcended words. "Let me go," she said, her voice trembling but unwavering, "or that child's blood will be on your hands." The roar of the approaching helicopter grew deafening, its rhythmic thrum vibrating through the ground like a heartbeat that threatened to stop at any second. Evelyn's breath came in shallow bursts as she stared at Officer Brooks through the squad car window, her wrists aching from the metal cuffs digging into her skin. Every second mattered seconds she had already lost to his arrogance and ignorance. And now, a child's life dangled on the edge of death because of him. From where she sat, trapped in the dark confines of the patrol car, she could see the sterile black container in Brooks's hands. His grip was firm but uncertain, his earlier smug confidence eroded by the crackling dispatch call he had just received. The sound of the air medical team's urgency over the radio haunted him now, and Evelyn could see it in his eyes even from this distance. For the first time, Brooks wasn't sure he was right, and that meant there was still a chance, however small, that she could fix this. Evelyn banged her fists against the car door with renewed vigor, ignoring the sharp pain that shot up her arms. "Officer Brooks," she screamed, her voice hoarse but unrelenting. "Listen to me. That heart can't stay out here. You've already compromised it, but I can still make it work if you let me go right now." Her voice cracked at the edges, but the force of her plea reverberated in the small space, punctuating every syllable with raw desperation. Brooks turned his head sharply toward the patrol car, the flickering lights casting strange shadows across his face. His brow furrowed, the corners of his mouth twitching with indecision. Evelyn could see his internal war playing out in his posture, in the way his shoulders hunched as if trying to shield him from the weight of his own actions. For a moment he seemed frozen, the container clutched in his hands like some enigmatic artifact whose importance he could neither accept nor comprehend. Then, as if snapping out of his trance, Brooks straightened, his expression hardening. He turned back toward the car, marching toward her with deliberate steps, the black bag still under his arm. Evelyn held her breath as the car door wrenched open with a squeal of hinges. Cold air flooded the confined space, but it did nothing to quell the fire raging inside her chest. Brooks stared at her, his face etched with frustration and defensiveness, as though searching for some reason to hold on to his mistake. "Explain this," he barked, his voice rougher now. "Explain why dispatch is suddenly talking about airlifts and surgeons. Explain why you're the one out here carrying something I still don't understand. You want an explanation." Evelyn's voice was ice. She shoved herself out of the car as much as the cuffs allowed, her face inches from his. "I already gave you one. But you didn't listen because you saw a black woman speeding through your city at night, and instead of asking questions, you made up your mind about who I was, what I was doing. That's the explanation." Her words cut deep, like a scalpel slicing through skin, and Brooks flinched before masking it with a sneer. "Watch your tone," he snapped. "I'm not the one breaking laws." "Breaking laws?" Evelyn interrupted, her voice sharp with incredulity. "I am a cardiac surgeon, Officer Brooks. That sterile container you've been manhandling is the only chance a little girl has at surviving the next hour. And because you couldn't see past your own damned biases, you've already wasted 15 minutes' time that I didn't have to lose." She swallowed hard, her chest heaving with suppressed rage as tears pricked the edges of her vision. "So don't you dare lecture me about breaking laws when what you're doing right now is tantamount to murder." Brooks's face twisted in anger, but Evelyn saw something else flash behind his eyes: fear. Real, visceral fear. He stepped back, his hand still on the container, though his grip seemed unsure now, as if he no longer trusted himself to hold it. For the first time, the magnitude of the situation was beginning to settle in, wrapping around him like a noose he'd tied with his own hands. The sound of the helicopter loomed closer, the thrum growing louder, more insistent, like an unrelenting drumbeat pounding into both of their skulls. It was as though the helicopter itself was screaming at him to make a decision. Before Brooks could respond, his radio crackled to life again, and this time the voice on the other end was frantic. Dispatch to all units, patient at airfield has deteriorated. Air medical reports surgeon delayed. Repeat, critical condition worsening. Immediate action required. Evelyn's heart stopped. Her knees nearly buckled as the words hit her like a sledgehammer. Critical condition worsening. The child was dying. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught in her throat, choked by the rising bile of panic and fury. Instead, she fixed Brooks with a look so blistering it could have cut through steel. "Are you hearing this?" she hissed, her voice trembling from the effort to contain her rage. "That's my patient. That's the life I'm supposed to save. And you're the one stopping me. Every second you keep me here, that child slips closer to death. Do you get it now? Do you finally understand what you've done?" Brooks's jaw tightened, the muscles visibly clenching under his skin. He looked back at the container as though it might suddenly explode in his hands. The sound of the helicopter was nearly overhead now, the deafening whir drowning out everything else. Finally, his shoulders sagged, and he let out a slow, shaky breath. "Get back in the car," he muttered, his voice unsteady. Evelyn froze, her heart leaping into her throat. "What?" Brooks didn't meet her eyes as he turned toward the patrol car. "I said, get back in the car. I'm taking you to the airfield." For a moment, Evelyn couldn't move. The words seemed too good to be true, too impossible after everything that had already happened. But the brief flicker of relief was quickly snuffed out by the fire of urgency. She pushed herself to her feet, nearly stumbling in her haste, and followed Brooks back toward his squad car. "The cuffs," she demanded sharply, holding her hands out in front of her. "Take them off. I can't work like this." Brooks hesitated, his eyes darting between her and the helicopter now descending in the distance. Then, without another word, he pulled the keys from his belt and stepped forward. The cold bite of the metal disappeared as the cuffs snapped open, and Evelyn yanked her arms back toward her chest, the pain radiating through her shoulders like fire. She ignored it, brushing past Brooks and snatching the black container from where he'd set it on the hood of her car. "Get in," Brooks said gruffly, already moving to the driver's seat. Evelyn didn't argue. She climbed into the passenger side, the container clutched protectively in her lap. As the squad car roared to life and sped back onto the empty road, Evelyn's mind raced ahead, running through the steps of the operation she would need to perform. She didn't look at Brooks. She couldn't. The anger still simmering beneath her skin was too much, and if she let herself look at him, at the man who had wasted so much time, she wasn't sure she could hold herself together. The airfield came into view a few minutes later, the helicopter's powerful lights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Evelyn barely waited for the car to stop before she threw open the door and bolted toward the landing zone. A team of medics stood waiting near the helicopter, their faces tense as they watched her approach. "We're out of time," one of them shouted as Evelyn reached the edge of the field. "Vitals are dropping, she won't make it another 10 minutes. Evelyn ignored the cold sweat running down her spine as she sprinted toward the helicopter, her grip on the container unrelenting. "Get me prepped," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I need a sterile field now. Move." Brooks stood back at the edge of the field, watching as Evelyn disappeared into the swirling wind of the helicopter's blades. For the first time, he said nothing. There was no barked order, no dismissive remark. He simply watched as the woman he had arrested disappeared into the chaos to save a life he had almost taken from her. And for the first time, Riley Brooks felt the weight of his actions settle deep in his chest, a weight that threatened to crush him entirely. The deafening roar of the helicopter blades made it almost impossible to hear anything else. Wind tore at Evelyn's scrubs and hair as she crouched low, her arms wrapped tightly around the sterile container as if shielding it from the chaos outside. Every muscle in her body burned with exhaustion and adrenaline as she ran toward the helicopter's open side door, her shoes slamming against the cracked pavement of the airfield. The medical team was already in motion, barking orders over the wind as they prepared the tiny space within the helicopter for surgery. Evelyn climbed inside, dragging herself up with the last shreds of energy she could muster. The door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the noise of the outside world. Inside the helicopter, the air was stifling. Medical equipment beeped and whirred, flashing lights throwing eerie reflections across the cramped interior. A girl no older than 8 lay unconscious on a narrow stretcher, her small chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and the monitor beside her displayed vitals that sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. Heart rate unstable. Oxygen levels critical. Time was no longer a luxury, it was an executioner lurking at the door. Evelyn dropped into the nearest seat, her shaking hands finally setting the container down on a tray. "Vitals," she shouted at the lead medic, a man in his 50s whose grim expression gave her the answer before he even spoke. "They're crashing, Dr. Holt," he said quickly, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've already administered the last of the stabilizers. If we don't replace that heart in the next 20 minutes," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. They both knew what would happen. Evelyn swallowed hard, nodding sharply as she unzipped the black container with meticulous care, her hands moving like machines despite the tremors still coursing through her arms. The lid lifted away, releasing a soft hiss as cold air escaped. Inside, the donor heart sat nestled in ice packs, its perfect form both miraculous and fragile. For one frozen moment, Evelyn let herself stare at it, at the organ she had fought tooth and nail to protect. Everything that had happened tonight, every insult, every wasted second, led to this moment. Her voice dropped to a near whisper as she muttered, almost to herself, "Not tonight. You're not dying tonight." Dr. Holt. One of the nurses called urgently, snapping Evelyn back into motion. She looked up, her gaze sharp as she barked out the next set of orders. "I need the surgical tray sterilized now. Set up the clamps, suction and monitors. We're running an O2 drip doublet for now. I want this cabin as clean as we can get it. If anyone so much as breathes on my sterile field, they're getting tossed out of this helicopter." The team moved with lightning speed, their movements honed by years of training in emergency trauma care. The tiny cabin transformed into a makeshift operating room in under 2 minutes. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves, her mind sharpening into its singular, surgical focus, a mental state she had perfected over years in the OR. There was no more fear, no more anger, no more resentment toward Officer Brooks or the hellish ordeal that had brought her here. The only thing that mattered now was the child on the stretcher, her heart clinging to its last fading beats. Evelyn took her place beside the stretcher, the girl's fragile body dwarfed by the sheer chaos of the medical equipment around her. "Scalpel," Evelyn ordered, holding out her hand. The nurse handed it to her without hesitation, the handle cool and familiar against her palm. Evelyn leaned closer, her breath steady as she began the first incision, the blade slicing cleanly through skin and tissue with a precision that came from years of experience. Blood welled up instantly, a stark red against the pale blue of the sterile drapes. Evelyn's hands moved quickly but deliberately, her focus unshakable as she worked to expose the child's failing heart. "Clamp," she said firmly, her voice calm despite the rising tension in the room. The medic passed the tool to her, and she secured it with a swift, practiced motion. As Evelyn worked, the sound of the helicopter filled the silence like a constant drumbeat, pounding in rhythm with the child's faltering heart. Sweat dripped down the back of Evelyn's neck, but she ignored it, her entire being focused on the delicate procedure unfolding before her. "Heart ready," she called, not looking up. "Ready, Dr. Holt." One of the nurses responded, holding the donor heart steady in a tray of ice, its faint motion a twitch, a pulse serving as a fragile promise of life. Evelyn took a deep breath, her mind racing as she prepared for the critical step of removing the damaged heart. One wrong move, one tremor of hesitation, and the child would slip beyond their reach. "Begin extraction," she instructed, her voice steady and clear. On my count 3, 2, 1. The failing heart was lifted gently from the girl's chest, its weak tissue looking like a shadow of the organ it once was. Evelyn didn't pause. She reached for the donor heart, taking it from the nurse with the reverence it deserved. It was still cold, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. "Placement," she commanded. "Let's go. Suction ready." "Ready," came the response. "Begin attachment," Evelyn ordered. Time seemed to slow as she worked, her hands steady as she connected the donor heart to the child's circulatory system. Clamp by clamp, stitch by stitch, the new heart took its place within the girl's chest. Evelyn's focus narrowed to a pinpoint, every nerve in her body tuned to the rhythm of her own movements. She blocked out the noise of the helicopter, the vibrations rattling through the cabin, the quiet prayers whispered by the nurses behind her. All that mattered was the heart. "Last connection," she said, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. "Prepare to remove the clamps on my mark." The team stood poised, waiting for her command. Evelyn's hovered over the clamps as she scanned the connections one last time, searching for any sign of weakness. Satisfied, she nodded. 3, 2, 1, release. The clamps came off with a soft click, and for a breathless moment, there was nothing. No sound. No motion. The world held its breath. Evelyn's gaze fixed on the monitor beside the stretcher, its screen frozen with a flat line. "Come on. Come on." And then, a blip. Evelyn's heart leapt into her throat as the line twitched again, followed by another. The monitor beeped once, then twice, the sound growing stronger and more rhythmic with every passing second. Evelyn's head snapped up to look at the girl's chest, where the new heart began to beat with steady, delicate motion. The nurses exhaled collectively, relief washing over the cabin like a wave. "We've got rhythm," one of them reported, his voice cracking with emotion. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained from her body. She reached up to pull down her mask, her face slick with sweat. The little girl's chest rose and fell now with a regular rhythm, her vitals steadily climbing on the monitor. "Closer up," Evelyn murmured, exhaustion overtaking her. "Monitor carefully until we land. Call ahead to the hospital, let them know she's stable for now." The nurses moved into action, finishing the final steps as Evelyn sank back into her seat. Her hands were shaking as she stared at the little girl, her chest rising and falling as though nothing had ever been wrong. Alive. She was alive. Evelyn let her head rest against the cold wall of the helicopter, her pulse finally slowing as the weight of everything hit her at once. As the helicopter began its descent, she caught a glimpse of flashing lights on the ground Brooks's squad car, still parked where she had left it. The man himself stood outside, his face turned upward toward the helicopter as it approached. For a brief second, Evelyn let herself wonder what he was feeling. Was it guilt? Relief? Shame? She didn't know, and she didn't care. All that mattered now was the life she had saved. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. What had happened tonight wasn't something that could be erased, no matter how many lives she saved. Brooks' face would remain etched in her memory, just like the sound of the cuffs, the coldness of his voice, the helplessness she had felt as minutes slipped away. As the helicopter touched down and the team prepared to move the child into an ambulance, Evelyn whispered to herself, "Never again." The helicopter touched down with a shuddering thud, its blades still roaring as the ground crew rushed to meet it. The frigid night air sliced through Evelyn as soon as the cabin door slid open, but she barely noticed. Her mind was locked on the rhythmic beeping of the monitor beside the little girl's stretcher, each pulse of the child's new heart like a fragile promise that could shatter if she didn't move quickly. Sweat cooled on the back of her neck as she stepped down from the helicopter, her legs unsteady after the unrelenting tension of the operation. The paramedics were already waiting, their stretcher prepped and ready to transfer the girl. "Vitals are holding steady for now," Evelyn called out over the wind, her voice hoarse but commanding. "Move her carefully. I don't want any jostling of the sutures. Call ahead to the OR and tell them to prepare for post-transplant stabilization. I'll meet you there." The medics nodded, their faces pale but determined as they lifted the girl's stretcher with delicate precision. Evelyn watched as they wheeled her toward the waiting ambulance, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. She was stable for now. But the line between survival and tragedy was thin, and Evelyn knew it better than anyone. Turning back, Evelyn's gaze landed on the patrol car parked near the edge of the tarmac, its flashing lights throwing streaks of red and blue against the cracked concrete. Officer Riley Brooks stood nearby, his silhouette rigid and unmoving. His face was illuminated intermittently by the lights, revealing a man who looked as though he had just been punched in the gut. He stared at the scene before him, the medics, the helicopter, the child whose life had hung in the balance, unable to tear his eyes away. Evelyn's hands curled into fists at her sides as she walked toward him, each step deliberate, the anger simmering just below her skin, threatening to boil over. The sterile container hung from her shoulder like an anchor, its empty weight a cruel reminder of the time she had nearly lost. As she approached, Brooks finally looked up, his expression a mixture of shame and something else she couldn't quite name, fear, perhaps, or regret. "You," Evelyn said, her voice low and dangerous as she stopped just feet from him. The wind whipped between them, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the fire in her eyes. "Do you have any idea what you almost did tonight? Do you have even the faintest understanding of how close that little girl came to dying because of you?" Brooks flinched at the venom in her words, his jaw tightening as though trying to brace himself. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. "You didn't know?" Evelyn's voice rose, disbelief cracking through her calm facade. "That's your excuse? You didn't know? Because what? You saw a black woman driving fast through the city at night, and you assumed I was a criminal." She took a step closer, her finger pointing at his chest. "You didn't ask. You didn't listen. You made a decision that could have killed a child. A little girl, Officer Brooks. Someone's daughter. Is that what you signed up for when you put on that badge? To make assumptions that nearly cost someone their life?" Brooks swallowed hard, his eyes flickering to the ground before meeting hers again. For a moment he looked like a man who wanted to defend himself, to lash out, but whatever words hovered on the edge of his tongue died as he looked into Evelyn's furious gaze. Instead, he muttered the only thing he could manage. "I made a mistake." "A mistake?" Evelyn laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and humorless. "No, Officer Brooks. Forgetting someone's name is a mistake. Spilling coffee on your uniform is a mistake. What you did tonight wasn't a mistake, it was negligence. It was arrogance. It was every damn prejudice you've been carrying around with you, wrapped up in one catastrophic decision. Her voice trembled with restrained fury as she leaned closer, her words like ice. And let me tell you something, if that child had died tonight, you wouldn't have been able to hide behind your badge. You would have been responsible. You would have been the reason her parents had to bury her. Brooks's face paled, his breathing shallow as her words hit him like blows. He opened his mouth to speak, but Evelyn cut him off before he could utter a sound. You think I haven't seen men like you before? You think this is new to me? You are exactly what's wrong with the system that put you in that uniform. You think your assumptions keep you safe. You think they make you powerful, but all they make you is blind. Blind to the people you're supposed to protect. Blind to the damage you cause. Blind to the fact that you're the danger you claim to be stopping. Evelyn's hands trembled as she finished, her breathing ragged as the anger drained from her voice, leaving behind a sharp, bitter edge. Brooks stared at her, his face unreadable, though the shame lingered in the tight lines of his jaw and the downcast shift of his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the helicopter blades as they slowed to a stop. Finally, Brooks cleared his throat, his voice hoarse and uneven. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he said quietly, as though the admission cost him something. I didn't. You didn't think, Evelyn finished coldly. That's the problem. Brooks looked away, his gaze sweeping over the tarmac, where the ambulance was now pulling away with the little girl inside. He watched it disappear into the night, his shoulders sagging with something that almost looked like defeat. Is she going to make it? He asked, his voice so soft that Evelyn almost didn't hear it. I don't know, she said bluntly, refusing to let him off the hook. If you'd let me do my job an hour ago, I'd be able to tell you with certainty. But now it's a race against time, and that's on you. The words hung heavy between them, a weight that neither of them could lift. Evelyn didn't wait for him to respond. She turned on her heel and walked away, her spine straight, her stride purposeful, despite the exhaustion dragging at her limbs. Brooks didn't try to stop her. He watched her go, the wind tugging at her scrubs and hair as she moved toward her car, the sterile container still clutched in her hand. Brooks stood alone on the tarmac long after Evelyn had disappeared into the night. The patrol car's lights continued to flash, their rhythmic pattern now feeling more like a silent accusation than a warning. His radio crackled with distant chatter, but he didn't hear it. He could still see the girl's pale face, still hear the anger in Evelyn's voice. His mistake, the mistake he could no longer deny, sat heavy on his chest, suffocating him in a way he had never experienced before. He'd made decisions before. He'd made arrests, issued tickets, flexed his authority like a blunt weapon when he thought it was warranted. But tonight was different. Tonight he had nearly killed someone, not with his gun, not with his fists, but with his ignorance. The weight of that realization was unbearable. It clawed at his insides, leaving him raw and hollow as he stood under the cold, indifferent sky. Brooks raised a hand to his face, dragging it roughly across his mouth as though trying to erase the taste of the night. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of the girl, her tiny chest rising and falling under Evelyn Holt's care. He couldn't shake the sound of Evelyn's voice, lashing into him with the force of truth he couldn't ignore. He turned toward his squad car, his steps slow and heavy. Sliding into the driver's seat, Brooks stared at the dashboard, the patrol lights still casting red and blue streaks across the windshield. He sat there for what felt like hours, the events of the night replaying in his head on an endless loop. He thought about his daughter, his Ellie, safe in bed at home, her chest rising and falling with the deep, untroubled breaths of a child who had never known how cruel the world could be. And then he thought about the little girl Evelyn had saved tonight. That could have been Ellie. The thought pierced through him like a knife, sharp and unforgiving. Brooks exhaled shakily, his hands gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had spent years convincing himself that his instincts were infallible, that his authority was justified. But tonight had shattered that illusion, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage of his own actions. For the first time in years, Officer Riley Brooks felt small. And for the first time in years, he realized he deserved to. The ambulance sped through the darkened streets, its siren wailing like a banshee in the night, cutting through the silence that had settled over the city. Evelyn sat in the back, her gloves still sticky with blood, her eyes locked on the little girl lying before her. The child's chest rose and fell in shallow, fragile breaths, her skin pale and clammy. The heart transplant had bought them time, but not much. Evelyn could see it in the numbers flickering on the monitors. The girl's body was rejecting the donor heart. The sutures had been flawless, the connections precise, but the stress of the delay, compounded by her deteriorating condition before the surgery, was pushing her system to the brink. Evelyn clenched her jaw, refusing to let the creeping edge of panic take hold. She couldn't afford that luxury now. There was a hospital waiting just 10 minutes away, an IQ full of the equipment she needed to stabilize the child. If they could get there, if she could just hold on a little longer, Evelyn knew she could pull the girl back from the edge, but it was going to be close. Too close. Beside her, the paramedic adjusted the oxygen line, his expression grim as he glanced at the monitor. "Pressure's dropping again," he said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "She's slipping into shock." "I know," Evelyn replied, her voice a blade of steel. She leaned forward, her hands moving with practiced precision as she adjusted the infusion lines and double-checked the stabilizer clamps. "Push the dopamine. Increase the drip rate on the saline. We need to keep her perfusion up until we hit the IQ." The paramedic nodded, moving to obey, but his eyes betrayed the doubt clawing at the edges of his resolve. He had seen this before: children hanging on by a thread, their bodies too fragile to recover despite the best efforts of even the most skilled hands. But there was something about Evelyn's presence, her unyielding focus, that kept him moving, kept him hoping. The child's tiny form jerked slightly on the stretcher as her body fought to reject the foreign organ, now keeping her alive. Evelyn's fingers flew over the clamps and infusion ports, her mind a blur of calculations and contingencies. Every second mattered. Every beat of the girl's new heart was a battle won, but the war was far from over. "Come on," Evelyn murmured under her breath, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and determination. "Hold on. You've made it this far. Don't stop now." The ambulance swerved as it rounded a sharp corner, the force nearly knocking Evelyn off balance. She caught herself on the edge of the stretcher, her eyes never leaving the girl. Outside, the city lights blurred past in streaks of yellow and white, but inside the ambulance, time seemed to stretch and contract unpredictably. Seconds felt like hours, and yet the hospital felt impossibly far away. Her mind flickered back to the events of the night: the sterile container, the cuffs cutting into her wrists, Brooks's face twisted in arrogant certainty as he held her back from her patient. The memory burned, igniting a fresh wave of anger that she used to steady herself. That child had come so close to dying because of him. She wouldn't let that happen now. Not while there was still a breath in her body. 2 minutes out, the driver called from the front, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Evelyn straightened, her hands still working with relentless efficiency as the paramedic monitored the girl's vitals. "Keep her steady," she said firmly, though her tone left no room for doubt that she expected success. Failure was not an option. Not now, not ever. The ambulance jolted to a stop outside the emergency entrance, the siren cutting off with a final echoing wail. The back doors flew open, and the hospital's trauma team was waiting, their faces drawn with focus as they moved in perfect synchronization. Evelyn stepped back as the team swarmed around the stretcher, her body trembling with the effort it took to relinquish control. "She's in transplant rejection," Evelyn said quickly, keeping pace with the team as they wheeled the girl inside. "The heart is viable, but her pressure's dropping fast. You need to get her on ECMO immediately and stabilize her electrolytes. I'll scrub in as soon as she's prepped." The lead surgeon, a tall man with streaks of grey in his hair, nodded sharply. "We've got it from here, Dr. Holt. Go get cleaned up. We'll page you if there's any change." Evelyn hesitated for a fraction of a second, her instincts screaming to stay by the girl's side, but she knew better. The trauma team needed room to work, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. She forced herself to step back, her eyes lingering on the little girl as they disappeared through the OR doors. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as Evelyn made her way to the scrub room, her legs heavy with exhaustion. Her hands shook as she peeled off her blood-stained gloves and tossed them into the disposal bin. The sink hissed as she scrubbed her hands clean, the water scalding against her skin. The adrenaline that had carried her this far was beginning to wane, leaving her with a hollow ache that went far deeper than the physical. In the back of her mind, she could still hear the helicopter blades, still feel the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. The memory of Brooks standing over her, his face filled with disdain, sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through her veins. He had no idea how close he had come to killing that child. He didn't understand the weight of what he had done, or maybe he did now. Evelyn wasn't sure which was worse. By the time she returned to the waiting area outside the OR, the minutes felt like hours. She paced the length of the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Nurses and doctors moved past her, their faces calm but focused, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. Every now and then, her gaze flickered toward the double doors, willing them to open and bring her news. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lead surgeon emerged, his face lined with exhaustion but not despair. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat as he approached. "She's stable," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got her on ECMO, and the rejection symptoms are under control for now. It's still touch and go, but she's fighting." Evelyn exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained from her body. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The surgeon placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady. "You did good, Holt. If you hadn't gotten her here when you did," he trailed off, his expression saying what his words couldn't. Evelyn nodded again, swallowing hard as she found her voice. "Thank you," she said quietly. The surgeon gave her a brief, knowing smile before turning back toward the OR, leaving Evelyn alone in the waiting area. For a long moment she stood there, her mind blank, her body heavy with exhaustion. And then, without thinking, she turned and walked toward the main entrance, her feet moving on autopilot. The night air hit her like a wall as she stepped outside. The ambulance was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the city at rest. But one figure remained. Brooks stood near his patrol car, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as Evelyn approached, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't quite place: regret. perhaps, or guilt, or both. She's stable, Evelyn said, her voice flat. For now. Brooks exhaled, his shoulders slumping as though a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. That's good, he said haltingly, his words awkward and insufficient. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, her gaze unflinching. Good, she repeated, her voice cold. Is that all you have to say? Brooks looked away, his jaw tightening. I'm sorry, he muttered. Sorry. Evelyn's voice cracked like a whip, each syllable laced with fury. Sorry doesn't undo what you did. Sorry doesn't erase the time you wasted or the risk you put her in. Sorry doesn't fix a damn thing, Officer Brooks. Brooks flinched but didn't respond. Evelyn took a step closer, her voice low and filled with steel. You need to live with this, she said. You need to remember this night, every single second of it, because it's going to happen again. Not to me, maybe, but to someone else. And when it does, I hope you remember what almost happened here. I hope it haunts you. She didn't wait for him to respond. Turning sharply, Evelyn walked back into the hospital, her spine straight and her heart heavy. The little girl was alive for now. But the cost of that survival, the sheer weight of everything it had taken, would stay with Evelyn for the rest of her life. And she would make damn sure it stayed with Brooks, too. Evelyn sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, the sterile fluorescent lights above casting a harsh glow over the room. It was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator cases and the occasional murmur of voices from the staff passing through. A cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of her, the steam curling lazily upward. Her hands rested on the edge of the table, still faintly trembling from the night's ordeal. Though hours had passed, the weight of everything that had transpired refused to lift. The little girl was alive, but Evelyn couldn't shake the memories, the cold metal of the cuffs, the flashing patrol lights, the sterile container nearly compromised by ignorance and arrogance. She stared down at her hands, seeing not the faint bruises from where the cuffs had bitten into her wrists, but the ghost of that child's chest rising and falling under her steady hands. The battle had been won, but it hadn't been clean. It hadn't been fair, and the scars both seen and unseen would linger. The sound of hesitant footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up, her sharp gaze locking onto the figure standing at the edge of the room. Officer Riley Brooks. He looked out of place here, his uniform rumpled, his face pale and drawn, his shoulders slumped slightly, as though carrying a weight he couldn't yet articulate. Evelyn's jaw tightened at the sight of him, and her fingers curled around the edge of her coffee cup. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with visible hesitation, Brooks approached her table. Dr. Holt, he began, his voice low and strained. I didn't want to leave without, he trailed off, his words faltering under the intensity of her gaze. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Without what, Officer Brooks? She asked, her tone clipped. Apologizing, trying to explain, or maybe just easing your own guilt? Brooks winced, and for a moment he looked as though he might turn and walk away. But he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath and lowered himself into the chair across from her, his hands clasped tightly on the table. All of it, he admitted quietly. I need to say I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I need you to hear it. Evelyn stared at him, her eyes narrowing as her exhaustion gave way to simmering anger. Do you think this is about me hearing an apology? She said, her voice rising slightly. Do you think your words undo the fact that you delayed me? That you put that child's life at risk because of your assumptions? You don't get to sit here and feel better because you said sorry. That's not how this works. I know, Brooks said quickly, his voice cracking slightly. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I understand what I did. I messed up. I was wrong. I saw you, and I didn't see a doctor or a person rushing to save a life. I saw something else. Something that wasn't there. And because of that, You almost killed her, Evelyn finished coldly. Say it, Officer Brooks. Don't dance around it. Don't sugarcoat it. You almost killed that little girl. Brooks's face crumpled at her words, his eyes dropping to the table as though he couldn't bear to meet her gaze. I almost killed her, he whispered, his voice hollow. I'll live with that for the rest of my life. Evelyn exhaled sharply, the raw honesty of his admission taking some of the edge off her anger, though it didn't soften her resolve. You don't get to just live with it, she said, her voice quieter but no less firm. You need to change. You need to make sure this never happens again. To anyone. Ever. Because this wasn't an accident, Officer Brooks. This wasn't just a mistake. It was systemic. It was prejudice. And it was entirely preventable. Brooks nodded slowly, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table. You're right, he said after a long pause. You're absolutely right. I didn't see it before, but I do now. And I swear to you, I'm going to do something about it. I don't know what yet, but I won't let it slide. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. Don't just make promises to me. Promises are easy. Action is hard. You need to look at yourself, at the system you're a part of, and ask what you're going to do to fix it. Because if all you do is apologize, if all you do is say you're sorry and walk away, then nothing changes. And this happens again. To someone else. Maybe someone who doesn't make it. Brooks nodded again, his face pale but resolute. I hear you, he said quietly, and you're right. Evelyn didn't respond. She didn't trust words, she trusted actions. And while there was a flicker of sincerity in Brooks's voice, she wasn't ready to believe it would translate into anything meaningful. Not yet. She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back with a scrape. I need to check on my patient, she said, her tone final. Excuse me. Brooks stood as well, his movements awkward as though unsure if he should follow her or stay. But Evelyn didn't wait for him to decide. She turned and walked away, her shoulders straight, her footsteps echoing down the quiet hallway. Hours later, Evelyn stood outside the girls' EQ room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Through the glass, she could see the child's tiny form surrounded by machines, tubes snaking across her bed like a web. The heart monitor beeped steadily, a reassuring rhythm that spoke of stability if only for now. The girl's parents sat at her bedside, their faces lined with exhaustion and fear, but softened by the fragile hope they clung to. Evelyn didn't interrupt. This was their moment. They had fought just as hard as she had, and they deserved this small victory. A nurse approached her quietly, a folded piece of paper in her hand. Dr. Holt, this came for you, she said softly. Evelyn frowned but took the note, her fingers smoothing the creases as she unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, as though written by someone in haste or under duress. The message was short but heavy with meaning. Thank you for saving her. You saved more than one life tonight. No name. No signature. But Evelyn didn't need one. She knew who it was from. For a long moment she stared at the note, her emotions swirling in a storm she couldn't quite name. Gratitude. Anger? Relief. Perhaps all three. She folded the paper again, slipping it into the pocket of her scrubs. Then, with a deep breath, she turned back toward the EQ, her focus shifting once more to the patient who still needed her. The road ahead was long, for both of them. But for the first time that night, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change, not because of words, but because of the sheer, unrelenting force of action. And Evelyn Holt was nothing if not relentless.